Hello everyone, today we talk about Roman artillery. This wants really to be an introduction to the topic in general and chiefly focusing really on the first part of Roman history, let's say up to late Roman times, it's mostly introductive because it focuses not on the specific pieces of typology of artillery, which I will deal separately in different dedicated videos. By the way, I already made something about the Roman onager. If you can search for that. So that's really the specifics of the machine and that specific typology, why it evolved, and so on. Today we were going to take a broader look at this to understand first when and how and why the Roman army adopted this kind of machinery from a certain point. What was the Roman mentality and background and bias towards this technologies, and how eventually this allowed in part to develop them, but also to make a bit of terminological distinctions here and definitions, because it happens actually very easily to fall on the names and their real meanings, especially when we really want to define strictly the typology of weapon, right? And it's fairly, maybe it sounds complicated the first time you hear it, but actually it's pretty clear, pretty simple. In absolute terms, it's nothing terribly difficult to remember. So today we're gonna look at these aspects, and in other videos we will go in detail to the various types of artillery. So basically, looking at the broader picture, you can think of Rome essentially expanding in this broader Hellenistic Mediterranean, right? So Rome, in many ways, its military machine is really unique. There is not really any evidence that the Romans developed their military system in their uniqueness that brought them to conquer what was the known world at the time, because they imitated other people's military systems. Now there's gonna be the single one of you who will say, oh no, well, because they had the hoplitic phalanx, they had them exactly like the Greeks, the Romans copied everything. No, it's absolutely wrong. It's a very widespread and common misconception. It has nothing to do with my intent to dispel this myth is nothing to do with ideological problems. I've been interested, at least for many years, in the genesis of the Roman military system that people really don't give a damn about, because the focus is mostly the early empires, if Rome was born the day before, and fortunately there is also some attention for the later Roman Empire, Byzantine history, if you prefer this definition, but the initial phases are kind of very complex, right? But I'm trying to at least entice even people who reason that way by saying that aside from this core military system the Romans developed for political, social, cultural reasons that were within the Roman system, in that italic dimension, etc., Rome did indeed adopt a lot of innovations, a lot of technologies and techniques from other peoples. This is absolutely true, right? But you cannot really understand the Roman warfare in general if you think that it was just a sum of of imitations, of copyings, and there would be really a lot to work even on the concept of cultural associations that modern people are literally obsessed by, because they have to say that that culture stole something from others. This is pretty dumb, because there is no culture ever on earth that hasn't massively appropriated itself of other people's cultures and know-how, and there is this core concept that should be sculpted in everybody's mind, that when you find a civilization, a culture that is able to imitate, to copy, if you want, even if you want to use this term, you're talking about a civilization that is already at the same level of the one that is taken from, because you can basically, if there is a civilization that is not developed as that one, you can tell them, you can show them all the way you want, but they will not imitate that. Also because most likely they're not interested, they wouldn't know what to do with that. These are things that actually should be very very well absorbed by anyone that wants to approach in general these topics. But unfortunately, the usual approach to this stuff is waving the flag of my own team and making the fanboy of this stuff, and it's just a pretty lame way to behave. Not even to make history, because history obviously it's a completely another thing. So when you talk about Rome adopting this, these various techniques, technologies, know-how, and experience, etc., you have to naturally contextualize Rome in its previous, in at least within the boundaries in which it eventually expanded into. And for the history of artillery, of polyursatics, let's say up to the 4th century BC, the unique weapons that were capable of projecting, let's say, to throw a projectile without recurring to the simple muscular force, were really the bow and sling. The most able archers of antiquity in this broader Mediterranean dimension, let's say, were capable, if using a composite bow, usually that was not typical of Europe, telling the truth. So here we're talking even about perhaps some more Eastern contexts, and even there that was an evolution, because not even the initial Parthian bow was the one that would be developed in those centuries afterwards. I mean, there are certain things, but we will deal with them when we'll talk about those specific contexts. But let's say that an arrow had a this sound distance could be reached in terms of usefulness of 150 meters, right? And obviously exercising this with the arm in this traction that could vary between 40 and 60 kilos, right? So when we talk about polyursatics in this artillery, we must think that really before the 4th century, even the late 5th probably, there is no evidence, at least, of stone projecting, let's say, or at least any kind of projectile throwers that weren't this form of stuff, which is pretty weird actually, because you see in other times in history that fundamentally the sophisticated, refined torsion engines that were developed, as we will see now in the Hellenistic world, were forgotten for some time, but because they didn't serve any purpose, they were inconvenient, economically speaking. Now we will also try to explain why. But there were other systems that were based, in fact, on muscular force, right? Like, to take the medieval Petraria, for example, they were extremely effective, telling the truth. Well, those went on, and it's a fairly simple, machinery, but it seemingly was nothing like this before. We have no evidence, right? There are, for example, if you read the Bible, there are actually these very specific terms like, siege weapon, machinery, and we don't really know what they meant. We don't know whether they could be, let's say, just rams or siege towers or stuff like that, or whether they were missile throwing machinery. We don't really know. And we start knowing what we call artillery, in fact, from this 4th century BC, that seemingly was started probably being developed before, not chiefly as artillery but as hand weapons, and this is a sort of crossbow that was allegedly invented. This is said by Heron of Alexandria, like half of a millennium later, in some Greek context, some Hellenic context. There are the gastraphetes, right? The gastraphetes from stomach bow, properly, because it was basically fixed on the ground and pressed with the stomach while being reloaded. And this is the great thing that really makes the difference, because this is a sort of crossbow, practically, that increases remarkably the traction, the available traction force in order to stretch the string. And there is this wooden guide that contains the arrow that is pulled backwards, simply by pressing on the rest of the structure with the body weight, that is, in fact, the stomach, as hence the name, and eventually was therefore blocked by a trigger, and therefore this way the weapon was capable of relieving the bolt with a traction force of 70 to 80 kilos. That is not, as you understand, radically much more than the composite bow, at least, but it has a sensible strength, and this is important because the idea is it can outshoot the bow, etc. It's a bit like the medieval crossbow, and yet it's a type of weapon that doesn't develop as much for reasons that are now complicated to explain. We don't, first of all, we don't know much about this kind of weapon, so it's particularly, usually it's credited that it existed because it's well described, etc. But we don't really know much about it in the first place. There have been reconstructions, but we still wonder why, for example, it wasn't more or less widespread. And the concept, though, is that not all that is that has this higher performances is, given the context, useful, right? Like the crossbow, for example, it has problem of the rate of fire, etc. But what we see, though, that it's what appears to be, and this is interesting because Heron of Alexandria tells it. He's the source, the only source for this weapon. Writes 500 years later. This is also a quite interesting point, but he says basically that the torsion catapults that would be developed later, and that we will see now, were basically deriving from the Gastraphetes conceptually, meaning that the torsion, as an artillery properly. Now the loading system from traction to torsion passes further, but eventually, but it's from here that the Gastraphetes is actually implemented, and it evidently becomes a sort of artillery that you can't even fix with your stomach on the ground, and there are many other problems with this. For example, the only thing, for example, being fixed on the ground, something you have to press. Maybe what if the ground is soft? Silly question, but it doesn't sound such a practical weapon, just like the crossbow, for example, would develop, right? In the crossbow, telling the truth, in medieval times, that basically comes back in late Roman times. This form of Gastraphetes in the form of Manu Ballista is actually much simpler, but it survives during the early Middle Ages, even if we don't hear much, and then in the High Middle Ages it starts developing once again. But if you take a 13th century Genoese crossbow, for example, the traction is something like 120 kilos, right? So it's a freaking lot. It's more than the Gastraphetes, that, however, wasn't probably that different from the average high medieval crossbow conceptually, in this sense. But it probably was less practical. It wasn't developed for some reason that we can't see clearly, just like the crossbow in medieval times. And what happens with the Gastraphetes, though, is that it gets implemented with other models that are larger, first of all, and they are loaded with a hoist, a mechanic hoist, actually, that allows to increase the traction force up to 300 kilos, which means basically you augment the range of fire to 250 meters. And according to Diodorus Siculus 24:103, it was Dionysius, the tyrant of Syracuse, to use for the first time this kind of throwing machinery on a large scale, right? Especially if the source refers to the Syracusan tyrants' war against the Carthaginians in 397 BC. And this was achieved by using and drawing those experience of the best technicians and specialists in Greece, in the Greek world at least broadly meant, that existed at the time. Now, the reason why this machinery was developed in this context is always remember this is traction force, not already traction force. We will see what will happen later. So there is kind of the debate of why it developed there. What was the context? Well, Syracuse was, as you know, one of the most important Hellenistic capitals. It was developing pretty fast as this Hellenic colony in Sicily that came to hegemonize large parts of the islands containing it. In fact, from the Carthaginians, who were mostly in the west. Interestingly enough, as we will see now, the Carthaginians would partially imitate the Syracusans and having artillery on their own eventually by the time of the Punic Wars, and that will be actually the first, if not the first encounter the Roman ever had with this kind of machinery, but however the moment in which they could obtain large amounts of this stuff in their own arsenals simply as spoils of war. And the idea is that we should distinguish Hellenic from Hellenistic warfare. That is a task. It's actually kind of difficult to explain in a few words. We will maybe make a video dedicated to it, but let's say that the Hellenic warfare, it's basically the one we associate to classical Greece. And it's not just anecdotal to frame this temporally and spatially, because actually Hellenic warfare proper, that is the one that was fought in the Hellenic motherland proper, really had its own special characteristics that, in spite the Greeks really exported expanded outside of the motherland, actually were not replicated outside of that. There is this broader idea that somehow the Hellenic colonization of the Mediterranean brought to the imitation, hence that prejudice about Rome included, but you can extend it to many peoples of things like the Hellenic hoplitic phalanx and all this stuff. It really didn't happen. There was a lot of material culture hybridism, but the forms of warfare in general, the forms of combat formations, military institutions were radically different in the other peoples, and even in the case of the same Hellenic colonies, actually the hoplitic phalanx was basically declined because of simply the environment where it was used was not useful anymore. Society was also different. There was a lot of hybridization, and this brought, incidentally, in part at least, to the development of this broader Hellenistic warfare, right? Where is Macedonia in this sense? The founders of what we call Hellenistic warfare, in terms of especially the overcoming of the hoplitic phalanx proper, and the creation of the phalanx of pikemen happens in Macedonia, at the outskirts of the Hellenic world. The Macedonians were barely considered Hellenes in Greece at the time. So, in regions that actually were very different from from Greece proper in terms of warfare. It's also very difficult to find in Greece proper a pure example of a battle in which everything was really that ritualized and that symmetric, let's say, at least by approximation, because there is nothing like a symmetric warfare by definition, but let's say that really resembles that model perfectly, not even in Greece, but let's say that this increases even measure the understanding that the far you went in changing the landscape, changing society, changing policies, changing enemies you have to fight, this thing really evolved in a very different way. And that's where Hellenistic warfare is properly born. And actually, the Greek motherland, in this sense, remains relatively untouched by these changes, or at least, they kind of lags behind in comparison to the Macedonian Empire and the successor states, and paradoxically, however, in these colonies, especially Syracuse is definitely the most important, but there are other cases. I'd say that this philosophy of Hellenistic warfare is very clearly received, and that's why I was specifying it before. It has nothing to do properly. I mean, it has to do conventionally with creation of phalanxes of pikemen, but that is also kind of another myth, in the sense that you really don't need. The Hellenistic military philosophy is something much broader than that. Even the Carthaginians were Hellenistic in warfare, partly even the Romans, basically, at least in certain things. But this doesn't. It's a deep misunderstanding and a typical technologistic prejudice of modern people to assume that came through technology in the broader sense. It was more a philosophy that brought to the inclusion of several elements together to have a combination that effectively worked for the sake of tactics proper, not because of a preconceived cultural notion that that still had its roots in seasonalism, this kind of archaic warfare that obviously was evolving even where things were still lagging behind, but that in this country, in these other powers, was much more developed. That's the reason why the Syracusans didn't have phalanxes of pikemen. That's why the Carthaginians didn't have. That's why the Romans didn't have. And we will have to explain. I'm really waiting a lot of time to make finally the big video in which I will explain this, because it's something I don't hear spoken around. You only find this kind of weird videos like that tend to try to explain the thing of the Roman legion versus phalanx and all this the terrible thing that everybody loves and wants to understand, because it was the technicality, it was because of the sword, the combination. No, it's not because of that. It's much broader, it's cultural, it has to be understood from a lot of background that generally people don't know a damn about at a serious level. It's not a matter of having read from somewhere some battle. It means to really have studied massively the history of those times. And so in order to explain the spread of artillery, well, you see that it starts happening in all around the Mediterranean, in these Hellenic centers that are produce this kind of machinery that sometimes is imitated also by other populations. It takes time, because even in the same Greek world, things didn't spring from one day to another. There was a complex development of this, and the Romans actually were still around. I mean, Rome is in the Mediterranean. It's observing, and even if it's not the first military machine that it's often regarded to have been since the beginning, because this is not how it happened. It was something else that made Rome great, and it happened roughly between the end of the 4th century BC and the beginning of the 3rd, but it was mostly reaching its apex towards the end of the 3rd. For reasons also now that you have to mostly trust me on, because I will have to explain another time. But it was in contact, or to say the Rome was in contact with this world. I mean, definitely the Romans, as well as other populations, knew what, in this sense, these peoples were about. Relatively to Sicily, actually, I didn't explain why this innovation seems to have started in Syracuse. We have seen that even the know-how wasn't necessarily from there. I mean, there were other regions, of the Mediterranean had been, hosting, this broader Hellenic culture, and that probably that's where the Syracusans partly also drew their this know-how from, and that managed, however, to invest into it, because this is the real problem: is that Hellenistic city-states are normally tyrannies, or they tend towards that direction of centralization that is really, very different from the original democratic model of the polis. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, outside of Greece, the Hoplitic phalanx basically declines rapidly and practically vanishes, and these Hellenistic powers mostly work with mercenaries, and so therefore picking the best bit of every culture and blending it together to have the best combination. Sicily was a very fertile land. It was a place that knew urbanization, both from the Greeks, from the Carthaginians in part. Even the Carthaginians had a different model The Greeks made really demographic colonies with lots of people in developing and more structurally. The Carthaginians, the Phoenicians in general, they were creating mostly emporia, that is, trade centers. They didn't make population policies in that sense. They didn't have a great population on their own, and in their city, by the way, as themselves. So it's something that has to be taken into consideration. But let's say it was a pretty urbanized area. There were enough resources. Those were governments that we have seen were fairly centralized. So it was possible to invest in these weapons chiefly for siege warfare, right? We have to understand the artillery and these early forms of, projectile throwers, whether they were hand weapons or larger machinery, started to develop in function of siege warfare. This is a bit of a constant in history. You find it even in the Middle Ages with the crossbow, etc. Let's say that open field battles, pitched battles were different and require other types of weapons. By the way, naturally, even the Gastra Fetus, if you consider it as a crossbow, it has its own limits. The reload time, let's say, is lower compared to the bow. I mean, nothing much different from the crossbow really conceived. There is still the question of why this weapon didn't spread itself so much. And the question probably was that, it wasn't probably so. We can't really see it through. Where even in open field, there were problems, even maybe on pointing it on the ground, having this broader ability. By the way, training a person to use a crossbow compared to a bow, actually, it's much easier, but it's still not so easy. For example, training for knowing how to shoot a rifle, so it takes some, and probably it has to do with the social composition of the wall. And I haven't gotten, actually admitted, not much in detail to the affair, but let's say that for some reason these crossbows probably never disappeared. I mean, I don't really think that we can say that this stuff really was present at this end of classical warfare, beginning of the Hellenistic one. But and for reappearing, as you know, in the late Roman Empire, think about the man of Ballistae, for example, that the Romans were used probably throughout all the early Middle Ages before developing in the more renowned medieval crossbow as we know it, iconically speaking. But at the end of the day, what I was telling is, probably this has to do with a degree of urbanization of this local warfare that is also pretty aggressive. That is to say that Syracuse is the big city that tries to swallow the others. And in other contexts, it's a bit more different. So it's really some factors that brought to maybe Syracuse in particular investing. Its tyranny investing into this weaponry on large scale, right? And we don't really know. I mean, it's just Diodorus Siculus claiming this. We don't know in which measure this weaponry was spread, but pretty, at least in large numbers, seemingly appeared at this time. This is still traction weaponry, right? So the Romans were just out there. We know that this is the same time in which the Battle of the Allia River, the same Gauls that defeated the Romans on that occasion are the same ones that are found in employment under Dionysius of Syracuse. So the world was very, very small, and obviously news ideas circulated. The Romans absolutely knew what this stuff was, and there is a source, a testimony that is, well, not really a testimony, but say just a source of Livy 6:9 that actually talks about Furius Camillus projecting to assault, to storm the city of Antium, using this machinery, these missile weapons, right? And this is Livy talking also in here from much later in time, basically this 400 years, that make the testimony relatively questionable, naturally, as you can question Heron of Alexandria. But in general, it's interesting that such information is provided. If anything, because Rome at this time was expanding progressively. I mean, in the case of Antium is also clear, Rome was now increasingly engaged in siege warfare as well. The point is that the time of Furius Camillus, many people actually believed that Furius Camillus was a historical character. Actually, there's no proof of this. As you know, he was this prominent political and military figure. He was censored for 403 BC, celebrated the triumph 4 times, was 5 times dictator and honored with the title of Pater Patriae, so the second founder of Rome. But actually, you have to think that anything that predates like the 70s of the 3rd century BC in Roman history is between myth and reality. Whoever thinks that you can look at Roman history in that past and saying, oh, this guy existed for real, really doesn't know what he's talking about in terms of Roman history, doesn't understand much how the thing really works. But I've found countless people that are so obsessed, for example, by these figures because of Rome and its greatness, that even refuse to accept what is widely known to anyone who at least is acquainted to Roman historiography and sources. So Livy's information is obviously the one of a Roman who lived in a time now where the Roman military made extensive use of such machinery, etc., and probably realized that at the time of Furius Camillus, such engines were, if not unknown, but at least they were something rare. So that to point it out from the before, where such news weren't there. And technically, I mean, I'm not saying, let's say it's possible in absolute terms that such eventuality might have happened. But first of all, what I said in here that I had to emphasize is that Furius Camillus plans to storm Antium by using this missile siege weapons. But he doesn't do it. He doesn't realize this purpose. So that's a misuse, but at least it was thought, it was planned, so that the Romans at least were acquainted to the know-how. That's just what we know, and it's realistic. I mean, historically speaking, it's possible. The only problem at this point is that we have to take a look at Roman military culture at the time. So the Romans, and this is very difficultly comprehended usually, is that they weren't born the military power that they would become later. Their military system was still in gestation, was being developed probably from this. I mean, talking about the Manipular Legion that eventually would emerge, is starting being, let's say, tested or thought and from this very period. Rome is definitely gaining power, is increasing, so it's perfectly possible that the new military needs of storming cities, etc., might have brought the Romans to conceive the use of this weaponry. But what is often, in fact, not comprehended is that Rome at this time was deeply still imbued with this sense of heroic warfare. This kind of tribal mindset, mentality was radically reactionary, conservative, traditionalist, and looked upon this machinery as basically as cowardly means, right? There is the Roman concept of fides, that is this sort of loosely translatable as fate, but in this case was used as, in fact, the, let's say, fair play, if you want, in war, right? So that there was fate that in this largely ritual, or at least idealized ritual warfare that still existed among the Latin cities, etc., that stemmed from the heroic origins, like of the Indo-European tribesmen, didn't contemplate the idea that you could kill someone at the distance, right? And this cultural thing is naturally very, very idealistic, because I suspect, and I haven't seen it actually in a fair amount of military contexts from the same sources, that these idealizations never quite met reality, or better, these idealizations existed because they were believed largely, but they, and still evidently, and at a level that was shared now by societies that were also relatively not so stratified, so that there was a general consensus about it. Rome was rocketing relatively fast, at least in this moment, also in terms of centralization, of having a system that could expand, but let's not exaggerate. They were still relatively similar to other centers of Etruria, etc. But the concept is always this: is that beyond the ideal, right, that you can't stress when someone still believes in this stuff, there is always the crude reality of war that is completely another thing, and that is somehow simply hidden, right, to make it very simple, from history, from reality. And I've already told you that basically this phase of Roman history is half myth and half reality. It's mostly legend, basically. We can't really see clearly through it. And it would be interesting with, where did Livy got this information? Of course, we don't know it. These things are universally known as unknown, historiographically speaking. But it's still interesting, the timeline of this, right? In the same century in which certain populations were developing this stuff, pretty close, because Sicily was fairly close. The Romans are witnessed by, to have conceived the use of such machinery by 400 years later source, right? I don't know. I personally don't think that Livy was, at least I want to believe that Livy wasn't trying to compare the Romans to other populations, in the sense that he wanted to show that the Romans were already as advanced as the Greeks. It's kind of, I don't think it worked in this sense. The Romans, especially Livy as a traditionalist, was really looking at the myth of Rome in at other levels, let's say. But there was this broader pride that the Romans now had acquired by the first century, that in terms of ingenuity, of logistical skills, military engineering that are displayed, in fact, in those times, were pretty, and now that are pretty sedimented, let's say, and structured into the Roman military as a default characteristic, right? So it's possible that that there was some memory that maybe such machinery that, by the way, are not better specified really in their form, but they were throwing machinery, and could have been employed already since that time. But it's evident for the rest, even of Livy's work and the rest of other sources we know about the Romans, that the Romans at this point didn't give quite a damn about it. And probably there was a lot of cultural resistance as well, and political resistance. It's hard to make understand to someone, for example, has never thought about this, how courageously reactionary Roman culture was at this time still, right? I mean, in certain sense it was open by default to, for example, to the inclusion and all this stuff, but from a political point of view, but still, let's not exaggerate. There was this sense that at least the broader core of Roman culture was founded. There were certain aristocracies at the top that controlled the rest of society. Also in here, we will have to talk about this more more specifically in our Roman history videos. And this using new machinery, even to storm a city, was, it was all about what was the Roman consideration of that specific war, of the of the changes that this expansion would have also brought into the Roman world. The Romans actually were beginning to specialize and into this progressive swallowing of all their neighbors, and progressive absorption, conquest, etc. But still, we can't imagine all the sometimes the undecision of the ruling class, etc., in taking certain directions. This would be especially evident actually at the time of the Punic Wars, because when most Romans, especially the most important part of the ruling class, didn't want to go outside of Italy. I mean, theoretically, the Romans were very Italic in this mindset. They were something totally different from the rest of the other Italic tribes, because they were a city at this point, and also but imbued with this kind of pretty still tribally warlike character, that they had literally to conquer everybody, but they were still of the idea that this had to be accomplished within certain boundaries, within certain means. So this is important because Roman history could have gone to another direction. So when using this machinery, we can't think that Rome was probably not ready yet to use them in large scale. And this would occur, in fact, much later. And not surprisingly, and this is where I get back on the concept of technological development, innovation, and cultural appropriation, that this actually happened structurally, systematically, only from the Punic Wars onwards, and especially from the Second Punic War onwards. And definitely, it was already, well started by the time of the third and last one, because that's the moment in which the Roman Republic does become an Hellenistic empire. Meant not 360 degrees, but at least in this terms of military technology and capabilities, where the Romans, albeit still pretty rough, pretty relatively primitive-minded. I mean, by the third century BC, let's be honest, I mean, Romans considered literates effeminated people. You can't compare this to the Hellenistic world, where literacy was something like... But that's also a bit of a cliche, because actually we know that Rome already by that time had a kind of a higher... very high literacy, but they weren't literates by profession. This is the case. So even in there, you realize that the Greek taste for technological achievement sometimes was really it was very theoretical in many ways. Was bent in the Roman military to the extremely pragmatic necessities of war. Right, the Romans were legitimately not interested in science proper. I mean, they were interested in everything that worked practically, which meant that obviously they had to use people who knew how to make it work. There were lots of Greeks, engineers, physicians. I mean, if you look at the Roman military, naturally it was easy for them, especially when they started to expand into Mediterranean, to draw this knowledge from especially the Greek world, right, that had already accomplished this stuff. But let's say that Romans started looking at this stuff also when it started working for them, right? And in the meanwhile, in fact, times change. Times change, and so coming back one step into the Hellenistic world, we see that the throwing machineries based on the push-ups, say a fort presented, so this traction, right, how when the bow was literally, there was a bow exactly in this Gastraphetes and larger versions of them, that have become effectively artillery, as we've seen before. I mean, the traction of 300 kilos now, it's like, something you want to use even effectively against fortifications, but it's by increasing the measures, the strengths, that the simple bow and traction loading system seemingly didn't quite work anymore, and therefore this system had too many limits, especially for the quality of materials and forces involved now with the increasing of dimension. So there was a further need that was to increase the performance by introducing, always in the Hellenistic world, between the 4th and the 3rd century BC. So here we are really in a fully Hellenistic world. It's not the end of the classical Hellenic period. It's a fully Hellenistic world. That there is a study and construction of machinery that were founded on a different principles, that is the one of torsion, right? So this principle is actually pretty simple to understand, especially when it's visualized. basically you have two flectors of the let's say the bow proper is substituted with two wooden arms, very hard wood, that are inserted at the same in turn inside two bundles of fibers known as tonoi in Greek, that are maintained vertically inside of a very robust wooden frame. And basically these two fiber bundles were posed under the torsion effort by rotating with a key and certain opposite flanges of bronze known as modioli, and that were in turn tied to the frame. All right. So, and the loading system otherwise was analogous to the one of the traction system, because there was this sliding guide that lodged the bolt that was eventually pulled backwards by a hoist to allow the traction of the string that was connected to the two arms, right? So at this point, it was enough at the moment of the throw to relieve, to unlock the in fact the harpoon block of the hoist, and to relieve all the energy of the torsion was accumulated within the bundles to violently project towards outwards, the compared to the wooden arms, the bolt that was sprung basically ahead, forwards by the string. So the fibers contained in the bundle, interestingly enough, were probably some of the most costly element of the wall structure, because they had to be constituted. They had to be elastic, right? So they had to be constituted by cords of various nature. For example, from horsehair, animal tendons, and Asian woman's hair. This may sound weird, but actually it is, because those are seemingly pretty elastic, and they were actually an asset that, I mean, a few people could afford. And the reason why it develops between, and obviously it's not just that, you have to have the know-how, the engineering capabilities, the wood, and this other material that you don't really find all at once, but especially you have to assemble in a way that costs really a lot. So this machinery, in fact, first of all, why does it develop in especially between 4th and 3rd century BC? Well, it develops actually in Macedonia, in Macedon, in this region that, as we know, was experiencing this very intense military innovation that was financed, right? Think about the mines of Thrace that Philip II of Macedon manages to occupy. So now, to have enough money to field a properly professional army, right? Something that the other Hellenic people had basically not had the possibility to levy, because it costed too much. Macedon is more like a kingdom. It's a territorial entity that is large, that has this landed aristocracy, this strong military ethos, and it works like a kingdom, right? That's why also it was despised so much by the Greeks, because the Greeks were totally in love with their own political system and of city-states, and they looked with disdain to all these kind of half barbaric populations in their eyes. If anything, however, Macedon came to subdue Greece in the process. And here we do not retell the story of Philip II, of Alexander III, and the creation, naturally, of the Alexandrine Empire, its successor states. But let's say that this was a model that up to that point was not available because of the lack of proper professionalism, right? Of having, professionalism was there. It was there evidently in the police, etc., but it required basically a class of professional military that was what the Hellenic city-states had actually been born against. That is, in fact, the military retinues of the aristocrats of the Hellenic Middle Ages, against which this peasantry had basically united, forming this towns, etc. So the fear of tyranny was strong. So as in many times in history, it's the army of tyrants that is made up by mercenaries that are simply people who work as soldiers, in fact, for money, by definition. And in the 19th century, we have started to attribute this negative character to mercenaries because the propaganda of the nation state wanted the idea that everybody has to fight for the motherland, right? Not for money. Well, it turns out actually, and also this myth that the mercenaries were unreliable. Well, actually, they were probably most reliable troops ever to be found. There are always been mercenaries that keep existing. And there's actually nothing wrong to it. I mean, it's like pure free market, if you want, and it's actually something through which civilization passed. In the case of look at the army of Alexander the Great, Alexander III. So that's exactly a defining moment in Western civilization in world history, and it passed through professionalism, which was unknown as a society entirely gravitating around it to the other Hellenic state. Hellenic, not Hellenistic, because in Syracuse, for example, it was happening the same. In other countries, now in the successor states, was happening the same. In other Hellenistic cores, let's say in tyrannies, was starting to happen the same, partly. This is also another very complex issue that we'll have to talk about a lot in detail. Like today, in order to introduce all these topics, I can tell you that I will have to do literally entire days of video about all of these topics, because they don't stop here, like with a simple synthesis. So forgive my approximations, but I'm trying to make you understand the essential, at least to go on. And so, to make the long story short, actually, the Macedonians are the only ones who have enough money to invest in a professional artillery park, if we can call it in this way, and therefore to develop this more on a large scale once again. So maybe the invention was already there, as it often happens, but the problem is that the invention needs a practical field of applications that requires investment. Well, the Macedonian army was, so that the Alexandrine armies work with this stuff to storm cities, etc., and they need machines that work, the right materials, the personnel to operate that, and therefore this thing gets replicated naturally. Even when the Alexandrine Empire crumbles, it's divided in all these successor states that all have inherited this way of warfare, that is the one on the model of the Macedonian model, that now, thanks to Alexander the Great, has entered into the legend, and it's still conceived as a sort of Hellenic accomplishment by the same successor states that were naturally radically different from what the traditional Hellenic mindset is, and that's why we call them Hellenistic. But they were simply also inheriting the idea that they had found out basically the most perfect military system in the world, because Alexander had used that, and Alexander had conquered the whole world. So what you have to ask, and ancient people were very very all about these things. Like they were about following the lead of the great symbol, right? And even the Romans were legitimately, I mean, think about Caesar, that he was complaining that in terms of his age had not accomplished enough as Alexander had done. So that's, for example, something that tells you how even the Romans looked upon the Hellenistic accomplishments by saying that's the model we have to run after, and there is a lot even in Roman foreign policy that in this sense is very Hellenistic, especially in the eastern provinces, etc. But still, the Roman military is relatively different. So talking about distortion catapults, now we have talked chiefly about darts, about bolts and arrows, let's say, but this machinery was used now even to throw, both for dimensions and also for in fact at this point the type of target that it could open to, could throw stones and other objects like sometimes even spheres like balls that could even bounce on the ground, stuff like that. And in theory there was no limitation for the weight of the projectile. Obviously there were physical limits, but the very interesting part of the fiber bundle is that basically you can augment it by adding fiber by fiber, so obtaining actually a quite precise level of power that you want to unleash. So also this stuff became increasingly more precise, and it was designed effectively primarily for siege warfare, albeit it was used also in other contexts that we will partly see now, chiefly for the Romans, because we're talking about them today. But it was chiefly about polyursatics, right? The idea that this artillery was used on average also on the field is it's something you start, especially the bigger ones, it's definitely false, but at least there are smaller versions that are used for that task, and we will see especially what the Romans will do about it. But these are primarily for siege, and they are for cover fire, for shattering the enemy walls, and splintering them, etc., and creating this cover fire to help the sappers, the engineers to create fortifications around the enemy walls to approach them, meeting with less resistance from the enemy, etc. So this is the main aim, right? And sometimes this stuff could be, it was relatively rare to find this stuff really in elsewhere, but during sieges, especially the largest ones, they're usually something rare in general, because a siege consumes an enormous amount of resources, and it costs frequently a lot. But at that point, if you're really going to do it at the same time, it's better if you also invest in this machinery, because that's what's gonna get the job done. So this becomes something like walls smasher in part, and as we were saying before, the first of this the type of throwing machinery is developed by the specialists of Philip II of Macedon around 340 BC. If I'm not wrong, Heron of Alexandria said that the first gastraphetes invented properly, built properly in like 420 BC, and so basically a generation later the Syracusans by the idea and start investing in them. So after like other 50 years, the Macedonians began to use this like in this way. And as we know, Alexander the Great made extensive use of this machinery in the sieges. Think about the siege of Tyre, for example. But where you realize that it's not just this throwing weapons, but also general siege engineering that is pretty damn developed at this point. And it's basically what the highest limit, let's say at this time, eventually after Alexander, the Hellenistic powers developed further this. But aside from a certain tendency for gigantism that is typical of the Greeks, the essentials would remain the same, right? And basically the Romans arrive at that same level. Yeah, they kind of developed, they implement certain things, but the bulk of the thing was this Hellenistic military engineering, and it was, in this sense, yeah, kind of an imitation fundamentally, because it's not that the Romans added to that something, something essentially new, right? And not even if they had those other typologies, it's just an implementation, right? The idea is it's born there, right? And this doesn't mean, by the way, that it's, that there is the Greek mark of fabric, like saying, if the Greeks hadn't existed, this stuff would have not been invented, because actually, there were same things being developed even elsewhere in the world, and this is something that it mostly derives from the necessity, and the it's as if the technology to achieve that is already present, because there is not many other ways you can achieve that goal of throwing a stone at that distance with that power. The technology was used in this sense was kind of the best for that specific type of employment, right? And by the way, consider that in this process there is the development of Hellenistic engineering that has started since the classical Hellenic times, in terms of developing of city walls. I mean, city walls were something, even in classical world, wasn't that widespread. At least, sometimes there were very banal fortifications. Now there are stone walls, city rings, etc. And so this machinery is also an answer to meet those defenses, right? To counter them in some ways. So it's at this point that terminology, I believe, is a bit necessary, because, as I was saying before, people tend to get this wrong all the time, and sometimes even the same sources do. But this is, in my opinion, at least the best, the terminology that was effectively adopted largely between the 3rd century BC and 4th century AD. So these are 700 years of warfare in which basically the technology remained unvaried, and the typologies of machinery were basically all the same, but they were differentiated as well. So from one side we have the catapults, right? So the catapults in Latin, in classical Latin, would be catapultae, right? Catapulta in ecclesiastical pronunciation if you want, but let's stick to the Restituta for ancient history. In Greek it's catapeltes oxybeles. So here basically these were stuff that were used for the throw of large darts or kind of javelins, like that, in this sense were conceived chiefly for the so-called direct shot. That is to say, if you basically have to pierce with this kind of bullet projectiles. So you have to have generally a aim that that doesn't get particularly ruined by the parabolic trajectory event that every projectile has. So even for this reason, and for the same nature of the projectiles, you understand that these were on average smaller machines, because they had to shoot at a closer distance to achieve this kind of direct shot, right? And the name in general, catapult, so catapeltes, it means literally, kata would be, kata in Greek is, right, it can mean, it's a preposition, can mean 3,000 things at once. In this sense is true, and pelta is the shield, right? So the most likely etymology in this sense is that these were machinery were designed to throw and to projectiles in order to pierce the shields. And it's pretty obvious, you understand why these were like, javelins and darts launched at terrific speed that could pierce every kind of armor at the time. and the pelta was the characteristic light shielded list, and in this group, so the main distinction is usually is really the type of projectile, right? And it's interesting that the Romans differentiated that, because we will see that the second type, that are the ballistae, are actually, they were called by the Greeks in the same way. We're still catapults, so catapults, but the difference is that they threw stones, right? So in the first group of these catapultae in Latin and catapultus auxibiles in Greek, there are also what the smaller machinery that are machines that were called by the Romans the scorpions, like scorpiones in Latin. So that's for a broader definition. Then there are the ballistae. So in Latin the term is ballistae, and in Greek instead it's catapultes litobolos. So the differentiation between the catapultes auxibiles and litobolos, as we have just said, is that the first is for shooting darts, the other for shooting stones, right? And these were usually, on average, larger machines. They were more powerful, they were heavier, and they were naturally and preferably used for really making very heavy structural damages, very often not preferably against the against humans, but against structures like walls and fortifications and stuff like that. While it's obvious that the dart, the arrow, is primarily designed to pierce someone, right? Even thickly packed formations, but usually, and this is why the fibers bundles are so important, is that these were kind of precision missile throwers. All right, they were conceived really for aiming and hitting at that specific thing. Also because they didn't have any kind of broader destructive effect. I mean, if you shoot a bolt, yeah, you can. The arrow can make some structural damage in general, but it's different from the stone, right? The stone can literally smash everything, throwing splinters all over. You can make a freaking mess. The arrow is preferably just to pierce some guy, right? So the ballista, in this sense, were preferably used instead to have this more accentuated parabolic throw that was particularly useful for also for hitting behind the fortifications. Every projectile has a parabolic trajectory, but in this sense it depends what effect you want to achieve compared to the type of projectile. So these were used presumably more like this, and also probably had a greater range in the sense that if you make a parabolic throw, you can. So these things were mostly more inclined. If you look at the Scorpio, for example, well, it was usually perpendicular to the ground, so that it was meant to shot at a relatively shorter range against primarily people in the front. Some kind of closer range before the bolt went down. Instead, if you throw against a city wall, which is usually something you don't want to approach too much because there are people from the other side over them that they're shooting at you at back, well, you can increase, right, the trajectory. The range by inclining more the shot, right, from above the ground, so that it makes this more parabolic shot that at that point hits more exploiting gravity than the proper force that it took to make it arrive at that point at mid-air, right? And therefore the ballistae were preferably used during sieges. But let's say that they could vary. I mean, I'm sure that the smallest catapult, let's say larger catapult, could be larger in fact than the smallest ballista, and vice versa. But these were primarily the two differentiations, right? But they had otherwise they were similar. I mean, even the Scorpiones, as you know, for example, were not loaded just with arrows. They could be loaded even with balls, with spheres, with stones, stuff like that. So it really depends on which use you want to make of them. Naturally, you have to imagine that the frame of these structures were under terrible strength. They probably broke down pretty easily because, by the way, modern reconstructions have attempted to test this stuff because nobody really know how they were practically built. I mean, we have some evidence, we have even some remains of those, but we are not really fully aware of what the performance was, because we don't largely know what the context was as well, and sometimes they broke down right pretty easily. So using this machinery was very important, and as we will see now, the Romans during their history kind of perfectioned and differentiated and implemented several types, also changing materials sometimes, passing from wood to metal, especially for smaller things. I'm thinking chiefly about the Carrick Ballista, that today we will not discuss in detail, but we will do one day, but we can basically say what it was. So, coming back to the Romans at this point, we, from the Hellenistic world once again, and let's observe when the Romans did really acquire this stuff, because we remained to the point in which the Romans were still traditionalists and didn't quite need this, and they were experimenting other stuff. They were busy into formulating their manipular organization and so on. So the Romans basically had this. It's true that they had this bias that were not very oriented towards the use of siege machinery, right? Italy was not dramatically urbanized at this point. Urbanism in Italy was proper chiefly of the Hellenic colonies and these other centers of Etruscan origin, Rome included, that were kind of cities, even though not the massive cities we can imagine. Think about the Etruscan Dodecapolis, that we don't actually know which, those 12 cities, which one they really were, and they were still relatively modest centers that eventually the Roman implemented later when they reached this major form of urbanization. The same is valid also for other regions, say, of Europe, but in Mediterranean. But let's say that the 3rd century, in this sense, is the kind of bit of the watershed. Naturally, it's 1 century, so it didn't happen overnight. But it's in this century that the Romans begin to use what we can call now their own artillery, right? And this seemingly started since the First Punic War, right? So this is interesting because as we were saying before, the First Punic War was fought in Sicily and for Sicily between the Romans and the Carthaginians. Syracuse was still there, incidentally, but it's fascinating because the Romans start to use catapults when they arrive to fight in the place where they had been originally pioneered as a technology and where they served because of the degree of urbanization that they encountered. In fact, when the Romans were besieging the powerful and well-defended Carthaginian, let's say the well-defended cities, for example, of Greek origin, but also the Carthaginian strongholds, they found that, first of all, their enemy was already using this sophisticated throwing weapons, because, by the way, in the meanwhile, torsion technology had developed also in there. So they had passed, obviously, also in Sicily and elsewhere, even in Carthage, from the presumably in Carthage, I'm not really sure, but for sure in the Hellenistic world probably meant to torsion engines, right? And yeah, surely also in Carthage at this point. I don't think there is any direct evidence of this. I mean, there is evidence eventually, as we will see now, of stuff that the Romans took from the Carthaginians that was already those kind of, but we don't have, I think, the direct evidence of Carthaginian artillery, nor archaeologically, nor how it was practically built. But I don't think there is any reason to doubt that it was different at this point from the other torsion engines that were used in the rest of the Hellenistic world. So the Romans at this point have to imitate them. They obviously start to use this stuff as prey of war. We remember that during the First Punic War, by the way, the Romans were already able to imitate some of the finest military technologies of the time. The Romans, for example, didn't have a fleet. They capture some Carthaginian ships. They understand how they're built. They copy it, and they make the whole southern Italian coastal communities building ships which put it at sea, and they manage to win over the Carthaginians, right? And this is really crazy in the sense that the Romans didn't basically know anything about maritime warfare. They're able to defeat kind of the best sailors that existed around with their own same technology, and implementing that even with the famous corvus and this basically this hooked platform that served to pour the Roman marines onto the Carthaginian decks to assault them, basically to bring the legions onto the enemy ships, and butchering them down. So this is what Rome was already capable of, and which is absolutely not bad for a population that up to 1 century ago was really fairly backward. So the Romans at this point, albeit coming straight from this Italic background that had known, some Hellenic and Hellenistic influence and so on, they had been fighting against Pyrrhus, by the way, that was at the time had the most advanced army in the Hellenistic world, that was even basically in great trouble when meeting the Roman legions on the field, and they can adopt this machinery as well in Sicily. And we don't really know how it happened. I think we don't have much of the details of this, but it definitely happened in the same way, in comparable for the ships and our stuff. Incidentally, there are some sources that claim that, for example, the Romans learned how to build camps from Pyrrhus back in the day. Now, this is probably an exaggeration in the sense that camps are to be built pretty much, even populations like the Germans or the Celts had camps, right? Fortified camps, stuff like that, but absolutely weren't the same degree of level of development of the Hellenistic and eventually especially the Roman ones, that when they basically built these forts, did it like no one had ever done before. But nevertheless, it's interesting because it tells you, like, as an historical testimony, that the Romans were learning in part from a Hellenistic school, right? And this siege machinery definitely was part of it. But the bigger, now Sicily was, as you know, the Romans won the First Punic War, so they seize Sicily, they seize also Corsica and Sardinia. So Rome opens itself up to this Hellenistic world by getting acquainted with the Magna Graecia as the at this pretty advanced area, of Mediterranean, but Hellenistic culture, and even if you look at that in literature, etc., the Romans start to appreciate. They start to change progressively their mind. They, from this rude, primitive, warlike, Italic background, they start getting kind of more sophisticated. And the big turning point, though, in absolute terms in Roman history, is the Second Punic War. The Second Punic War brings the Romans outside of Italy, so that makes them take a step from which, I mean, well, technically the First Punic War did as well, but it wasn't so, let's say, it brought Rome to a sort of Mediterranean domination that previously was not thought of. If anything, because Carthage was there. If anything, because there were other Hellenistic kingdoms out there. So, with the Second Punic War, it's really beyond. It's really Rome investing all of itself outside and passing this broader complex that Rome also felt towards, for example, Hellenistic warfare. The Romans, for example, before beating the phalanx, had this imbued fear that the name of Alexander and the great military commanders, and also their bloody experience with Pyrrhus, had, rightfully showed them. So it's a moment of transformation, and the first impact, let's say, with large masses of let's say of siege machinery, of throwing weapons, that is in the Roman military history, is in 209 BC, when Scipio captures the city of Cartagena in Spain during the Spanish campaign, where he finds this arsenal of throwing weapons. It was composed by 120 great catapults, 281 small catapults, 23 large ballistae, 52 small ballistae, and a large number of scorpions and other machinery. This is Livy 2647. So basically, as you know, Cartagena was the major city in, at least one of the major cities in Carthaginian held, or Barcid better, held Spain. So it's pretty big depot. Even the siege of Cartagena is a masterpiece of the Scipio's obsidianal capabilities. And while they storm it, they find all this huge amount of stuff. And now we don't know, even in here, where Livy got the information from. We don't know whether these numbers are correct, but they are pretty large amounts of this stuff. And the general idea is that this stuff was probably not this enormous military, this huge siege machinery. Even when we talk about these large catapults or ballista, probably they weren't something so dreadfully enormous. Also because, by the way, the Carthaginians were, at least the Barces, if you take Hannibal, it's not that they had a huge amount of siege expertise. I mean, even the sack of the storm of Saguntum had been pretty costly. I mean, there was something about probably that we can't really focus on, but the Carthaginians had not dreadfully invested into siege warfare. But nevertheless, this amount of stuff tells you that, at least for defense, these weapons were employed in base numbers, and this is kind of obvious even if you consider what the purpose is. This is basically a mechanic missile thrower, and if you place this in city walls, etc., basically you can't stop really lots of people making a saturation fire, something like that. So you have to think of siege warfare this time to be something extremely dynamic, something extremely bloody, as you can imagine. Not that the rest of ancient warfare was particularly bloodless. It was literal butchery and nothing more, nothing less. But this is when the Romans start getting all of this stuff in one shot, basically. So this is stuff that is naturally preserved. Obviously, it kind of could rot down. This is at the end of the day, they were still made in wood, etc. But it's obvious that at this point the Romans are boundless in terms of availability of this material, if anything, for prey of war. And I don't think we know a big deal actually about the development of this machinery in Rome proper. I mean, we get that the Romans are in possess of this stuff through spoils of war, but we don't know that much about what they were literally doing in Italy by producing this stuff, and it's possible, by the way, that most of these machines could be found even. I mean, first of all, they could be built in loco by a certain degree. Others were actually provided by the same Roman allies. I mean, when Rome expands into the Hellenistic world, there are all these city-states that are eager to assist the Romans. It happened in Sicily, for example. So it wasn't that difficult to get this thing done, and probably the Romans didn't even need to invest more than much. It's like a bit with the auxiliaries, right? You know, it's the myth that, for example, that the Romans didn't have a strong cavalry. Well, yeah, because from a certain point they could get better cavalry from peoples that made extensive use of it, and they didn't need to invest in their own in that sense, where the bulk of the armies were, you know, still these heavy infantry that's what Rome reasonably instead bred on her own, right? So this part explains the story. At the end of the Third Punic War in 146 BC, the Romans also captured, are meant to have, this is Appian, says from the Punica 80, that the Romans captured something like 2,000 throwing weapons in the only in the city of Carthage, right? Which is fair. I mean, you know, that was the capital, but you know, there were many other Carthaginian cities held along the African coast and in the rest of Spain when they had been conquered during the Second War. So at this point, the Romans are fully into artillery, right? And they don't lose. They don't lose taste for them, indeed. So the Romans, you know, let's say the specialists that the Roman army began to use, that were entrusted with the task of building and to employ actually and deploy the artillery, were initially based almost entirely on the experiences that were matured within the most important specialized artillery builders of the Hellenistic East. And we're talking chiefly about the cities of Rhodes, of Pergamon, and Alexandria of Egypt, right? So these were all cities that had developed. Rhodes was an independent city-state. Pergamon was was a sort of was a part of the successor states. It was basically the Attalid dynasty ruling in the west of today's Turkey. Alexandria was Alexandria of Egypt, the Ptolemaic capital of Ptolemaic kingdoms, and these were. It's interesting because these are all very important Hellenistic centers, and they're the ones that were also associated to a great deal of scientific and philosophical development at the time. So when you look at Hellenistic science and ancient science in general, you don't think that this was really rocket science, right? You know, 90% of what is called science was just sort of philological taste for encyclopedic knowledge, and it was very theoretical. I mean, the whole Greek world was imbued with this love for theory, maybe didn't even found concrete application. So it would be interesting maybe to deepen a little bit more. But let's say at least that the scientists that knew how to build this stuff, who had studied, who knew the engineering, came largely from the Hellenistic world, just like other specialists, like we were saying before, like military physicians, surgeons, there's people like this, because simply the Hellenistic world had been developing that stuff, you know, blending Hellenic culture with the great other cultures of the East, and that was kind of the best in terms of scientific development existing at the time. So the Romans at this point, in practice, so aside from this relation of relative relation of dependency from this foreign personnel, they quickly learned and applied without any problem the building technique of such machines, and cumulating in relatively few years actually experience and knowledge that were indispensable for the future conquests. This time Rome is legitimately expanding into the Mediterranean that is sort of a Hellenistic lake, is heavily urbanized. It has all these very big florid Hellenistic cities that are conquered by one, or at least come under Roman domination, and this basically goes unopposed. I mean, Rome enters in an environment that for which the usage of these technologies had become standard, evidently, since more than 1 century. I mean, since Alexander's conquest. So it wasn't a matter even of relying exclusively on knowledge of this world, but it was simply hiring people who knew best and that Rome could afford, and that's it. Because otherwise the Romans would have found a way to use this stuff, to produce this stuff on its own. So it's not, as I was saying before, that these were terribly complicated technologies that a big Mediterranean empire of this period could have not created on its own, even if the Greeks, let's assume, had not existed. As far as we know, there are various hypotheses how even these mechanisms came into play. I mean, culture has no color, has no brand, has no name. It simply, if it works, people use it and figure it out, and that's pretty much it. And in the 10th book of his treatise on architecture, Vitruvius, that incidentally was also an architectus in the Roman military, as with Caesar and Octavian, which it really tells you a lot. So he was a specialist of destroying weapons. Dedicates 3 chapters to artillery, right? So I don't think we have to present Vitruvius and his importance on ancient and medieval and even partly modern architecture, of course, and engineering broadly meant, but that's kind of a big name. And he was incidentally involved even in this military expeditions at the time of the peak of Roman expansion under between the 1st century BC and 1st century AD. So what is interesting is the employment of lighter stone, lighter artillery, the scorpiones that we have defined before, in particular, that as far as we know, we can hypothesize, at least, it was fairly spread also in the more dynamic tactical scenarios, right, and on the battlefields, and basically everywhere, also in terms of strategic theaters, in the sense that you don't really have to bring with yourself the huge 1 talent ballista. You can use the smaller things to use, like for sniper fire, for harassing the enemy, for we see now sweeping certain, for example, river banks, etc. And were dramatically useful. And we know that the Greeks also did something like this. Artillery was used sometimes to block mountain passes, to shoot on thickly packed formation. Let's say that it wasn't the original design, that's still was unavoidably confining this machinery largely to siege warfare, but definitely, hey, it's still something that shoots balls and stones. You can't really use it to destroy people physically, so it can work just fine. River fordings, for example, that also became useful for defending and guarding them. It's possible that the relative simplicity of employment of this lighter artillery brought to the let's say the spread of it, even among single units. Like, it means troops were committed like in first line, right? After at least the supervision, under the supervision of this specialized architect in Latin, which means that these were employed. These weapons were brought alongside the Roman legions, and used to, and conceived to be immediately deployable as soon as the enemy was, as soon as you were in contact with the enemy, in order to engage him, right? To support cavalry, as we will see now, also in containing the enemy before the heavy legionary infantry could deploy, and to offer the heavier response to the enemy. And there is a fair good example of the employment of these machines, for example, in the works of Caesar. This is important because otherwise, between Polybius and Caesar as sources, it's not that we know freaking much about the Roman military. I mean, we know more about the Roman 3rd century proportionally than we know 3rd century BC, than we know, for example, about the 2nd century BC. Then there is Caesar during the 1st BC that naturally writes a freaking lot of stuff that obviously makes us know even these details, but otherwise, we can imagine that there was a development throughout all the centuries, and that in fact, especially Caesar's armies now are armies that the Romans use with those formulas and engineering capabilities since a long time. Now it's a very consolidated military instrument. Caesar doesn't have to do anything but to give orders, not to reform the army or to bring innovations, because that was already freaking fine. And even Marius, that is often credited to have changed who knows what, in practice he didn't do anything. He just made a political and social reform. The army had already, let's say, changed by itself. All what is traditionally attributed to Marius is obviously not. I mean, do you think that Marius actually changed, the position of the shields during the march, not to make the soldiers banging with the legs? I mean, it's idiotic. It didn't come. This military reforms have almost nothing to do with the actual tactical employment. That there is something that the armies had been developing and they do develop by themselves because they develop according to the needs, and that's pretty much it. In all military contexts. So, and I think it's gross to see how many, how we have to emphasize like these figures like cornerstones of the military evolution. Why, by the way, to anyone who knows a bit of Roman history, these are universally unknown topics. Like, we don't know a freaking damn thing about the Roman army. We have to be honest about it. I think that we know much about the Roman army. Actually, we don't know almost anything. For what it concerns, how it worked, how it developed, how it was, arrayed, etc. It's all conjectures at best, right? And however, Caesar tells us, in particular now, this was just my rant, digressive rant, because these are important concepts to remember. But coming back on Caesar, let's say, he offers us a lot of very interesting information about the tactical modes of employment of these artillery. Some catapults were used, for example, were operated from the ships that were making the Roman army land in Britain in 55 BC. That's cool because that's used as simply sweeping the beaches to make the Roman infantry occupying it. This is from the Bello Gallico 425, by the way, if you want the reference. And then they're employed also in the operations against the Belgians, the Bello Gallico 2.8. And there is also a pretty wide employment of tactical emplacements of artillery in order to protect the flank of his own legions. This is pretty interesting because that means that this stuff was used even to target cavalry, which makes sense by certain standards, because not just horses are bigger targets, but let's say on the flanks, that's where mostly cavalry operated, right? So you can even, make the horses freak out and say disordering the charge and all. So it's a place where you want to deploy them, and to create this barrage of fire, because you really have to consider it this way at this point. It was nothing like modern field artillery, of course, but it conceptually was used as mobile field artillery, definitely, and it's pretty, natural. I don't think we have, in fact, and these are kind of smaller. This is smaller artillery. For example, at the Battle of Gergovia, if you look at the Bello Gallico 741, this artillery had revealed indispensable for the Romans in order to repel the Gallic attacks. And at Alesia, the Bello Gallico 781, they were mounted on the towers that flanked the chain of Roman fortifications that allowed Caesar to basically to compensate with the numeric inferiority in which he found himself against the Gauls. So pretty useful, and so you understand that, especially from this Caesar's evidence, you realize that since an early date there was a substantial use of this smaller field artillery. Gaul, had certain fortified centers. That was a sort of pro-urbanized region of Europe, but you don't really need the huge, gigantic catapults, the ballista that you find in employed in Hellenistic times by Demetrius Poliorcetes, for example, it was more useful for kind of small tactic affairs, and this is pretty interesting, and it also confirms basically that there was a continuity. Remember all this stuff the Romans find into the Carthaginian arsenals when they take that. Well, this kind of gives an idea that probably we are attracted by the bigger guns, right? We see this massive ballista that can show this huge stones, etc. That's cool. Wow, that's Roman power being delivered just one shot. Yeah, but probably the larger employment was really, it was probably much more widespread when we think by certain standards since the beginning with this smaller machinery. And it would be interesting to confrontate that in the Hellenistic world as well, because that's where it came from. And I'm not aware of particularly, I'm aware of several episodes where the Hellenistic armies used this stuff on the field, like not in open field, not during sieges. But there is not evidence of this very frequent and synergic use you find into Roman employment. It would be interesting to confrontate this and why it happens and what we can't think about it. So getting into what it's conventionally called the early empire, but in 16 AD, Germanicus uses artillery in order to dislodge the Arminius Germans, by the way, from a terraplane that was in a more elevated position compared to relatively to the Roman troops. And this is particularly interesting because it tells you that that was used as sort of the Germans made extensive use of terraplanes and ditches, etc. And think about the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. They tried to create problems like that, and the Romans therefore had a pretty easy game at having this artillery with them in order to dislodge them from there. It's not the first, it's not the only example of this. The if I'm not wrong, the same Germanicus at one point even sweeps the banks of, I don't think it was the Rhine, I could be wrong, but to in order to make the Romans pass, right, and then the Germans are dislodged from the other bank of the river, and the Romans can pass. There is evidence of a, for example, but we'll say it later. And by the way, that episode of Germanicus against the Germans it was instrumental. Artillery fire was instrumental in order to prepare the assault for heavy infantry, Roman heavy infantry, right? And it's pretty cool because it's like precursing in some way, approximately at least, the modern tactical use of field artillery, right? By the way, this episode is from Tacitus Annales 220, by the way, if you want to look at it. Corbulo. Here we are in the east. Roman general, he fights in this expedition in 62 AD. And he manages to shoo basically the terrible, dreaded Parthian archers from the Euphrates River by deploying a series of pontoons armed with powerful catapults. I don't remember where I was messing up here, maybe the reference with the German. No, I don't remember, but these are not perhaps all the stuff that I was able to find. So this is from always from the Annales, Tacitus 15:9. There's this other episode of Vespasianus when he was commander of the 2nd Legion Augusta in Britain. He conquers rapidly several strongholds through the use of catapults. This is from Suetonius Vespasianus 4 as a reference. And what is interesting is that, remember what I said before about the bigger ballista usually employed against fortified cities. Well, yes, but some of them were used even in open field against troops in occasion pitched battles. For example, at the Battle of Bedriacum in the year of the four emperors, in 69 AD, the 15th Legion allowed this gigantic ballista in order to hit enemy infantry. This is instead from Tacitus Histories 323. And the reason is obvious. You have this machinery for whichever reason, and why not smashing a bunch of thickly packed Roman legionnaires, given that this is a civil war amongst the Romans, to wipe them out. It's pretty effective to open big gaps. So here the dimensions are important as well. And as we were saying before, remember that this artillery was well, about this I'm not sure, because I don't know about the lowering and the rising of the degree of the throw, but let's say that some projectiles were all kind of spheric, right? So the theory was you could even launch this stuff and create a sort of ricochet effect, which is something that actually was used like this even by later, fire arms artillery, because the objective was not really hitting in the midst of the enemy ranks, but it was just to make the ball bounce and to have this very strong kinetic force that would break legs within the rank and opening these terrible gaps. It sometimes was not even aimed actually at killing people, but simply at disordering them. Especially if they see the ball arriving, they bouncing on the ground in front of them, they have literally the time to freak out and to run away, and opening these big gaps in the formation to disorder the whole thing. And this is how literally even artillery worked before shell. Throughout the modern age, or throughout all the modern age in Napoleonic Wars, That was the first objective or theory in the field, naturally aside from siege warfare. Against the troops, right? Disordering them. So that kind of makes sense, and unfortunately we don't have greater detail from this, but it's nevertheless understandable why it could have been done. Then, talking about more conventional, let's say, employment of Roman artillery, well, of course, Josephus Flavius, the Judaic War 366, during the Roman siege of Iotapata in Judea, Vespasianus, that always had his assaults preceded by a very thick fire of projectiles, disposed of over 150 throwing machines, right? And some of them had one stone, could throw one stone, were capable of throwing one stone of weighing 1 talent, which would be 26 kilos, right? And that's pretty, it's not a few, right? And I quote from actually another passage of Flavius Josephus, obviously from the Judaic War 3:7-23, and by translating here he says that the violence of the ballistae and of the catapults smashed, basically put down several men altogether with a single blow, and the whistling projectiles thrown by the machines destroyed the ramparts and splintered the corners of the towers. And it doesn't exist such a strong formation of fighters that cannot be overwhelmed up to the very last row by the violence and the greatness of these projectiles. An idea of the greatness and the power of these projectiles, these machines, can be given by what happened that night in the story. And it says that one projectile basically made, beheaded a man, one of the men that was on the walls together with Josephus, and throwing basically throwing the head at 3 stadia of distance, which is roughly something like 400 meters, and that can give you a reason. But there are various elements of this story, like of even pregnant women hit by these balls and fetus, going. Well, yeah, I mean, it's terrifying. But this is important. Now we will also explain why so much interest in detail, broadly speaking, in the Roman Hellenistic world towards this effect. What is freaking amazing of this passage is that it says that there is no formation that cannot be basically pierced throughout all the rows by one of these machinery, which really tells you that probably Josephus had seen this thing employed against thickly packed formations, not just like on guards over the walls, right? So this was freaking tough. Just seeing, think about the horrid, look of people getting, turn it to pieces like that. But remember that Josephus here was writing to praise Roman military power, right? So these horrific details are actually designed to spread, to play in Roman deterrent policy, right? So I would like to talk, since I mentioned it before, what happened towards the end of the 1st century AD, where there is a sort of further refinement of the this military technique of actually of this the same the improvement of the same structure of this machinery, because this is, by the way, the same period in which Heron of Alexandria writes. So, since we were mentioning him since the beginning, well, that's at the point at which of the story in which he was writing from to understand what had been happening before, right? And Heron's work is particularly important because he defines, in a sense, the theoretical principles and formulas for the project, the project of this very powerful machinery, through which there was also the so-called Carrick Ballista that seemingly was employed in large scale in the Dacian Wars of Trajan. There is, in fact, also in the Trajan column some of the best representation. And the Carrick Ballista, today we don't have time to look at it in detail, but basically, to make it very simple, it was actually a small, it was a small catapult, right, that was made not really of wood, but of iron, of metal. This basically made it much easier to operate because it was more resistant. Okay, it's more costly, of course, but it's it obviously decays much more. It doesn't decay like wood so quickly. He takes better, absorbs better all the strengths and the usury. Etc. And it could be assembled and disassembled pretty easily as well, and therefore this means that this is actually a specialization of Roman artillery that is born out of the very dynamic and frequent use of the smaller catapults that the Romans made of the smaller catapults, because evidently, this is something that the ancient world had not yet experienced, right? Like the Roman military at this point was investing. The Roman state was investing a freaking lot in the Roman military in a way that no other empire in history had done up to that point, at least in the West. So the point is that the Romans get to a level of specialization that the Greeks had still not reached, in terms, especially of employment into this very this professional and permanent army that the Romans had always stationed, right? So that the legions were always standing. It was not the Macedonian phalanx, for example, that theoretically whose colonists were settled down and they had to be called once again like a sort of militia. It doesn't matter how professional, even though they were trained, etc. The Roman legions were always there. There was a much larger organization. Everything was framed into a much much broader system, and therefore this artillery was given, as we were saying before, even to like the best thing you could have around. The best equipment was rendered available by standard for any kind of tactical employment. So the Carrick Ballista basically is designed like this, and at the beginning of the 2nd century AD, the Roman army found to be assisted by the most powerful arsenal of war machines in the ancient world, right? Quite simply, and in the there is the Carrick Ballistae basically are the Carrick Ballistae, that is basically the smaller catapults mounted on chariots, right? That are pulled by animals that really reflects the needs for flexibility and this, ready and quick deployability, right? That is comparable to, conceptually at least, to modern mobile artillery, right? So these were catapults that had to be deployed in any kind of situation, right? Even in the small skirmish, because effectively at that point they could make a difference. I mean, sometimes they were enough for doing that. And never underestimate even not just the performance, because people say, oh well, then they used them like kind of machine guns. I mean, the Romans, had been able to form even a sort of some forms of even sort of not really of repetition of automatic guns, because it wasn't like that, but say they had been able to make a kind of a to make the throw speedier, and this stuff could really fire at a decent rate, especially the smaller catapults like this one. So it could really be effective, but never underestimate the ideological under this, and now we will explain it in a while. In any case, I wanted to conclude the list by saying that Arrian describes at a certain point the deployment, the array of artillery in the column of march of the Roman legion, and it's very interestingly preceded by legionary cavalry, and it precedes the legionary infantry. So basically, you have in the column of march cavalry in front that obviously is out there to scout, to have this very flexible deployment and etc., to be speedy and to inform the rest of the army, etc. But immediately after the cavalry, before in front of the legionary infantry, you have this mounted artillery. So it's freaking that tells you that what the use had to be. That if the cavalry was in trouble and were skirmishing the enemy, this stuff could arrive on the chariots and start targeting the enemy wherever they were, and screening or maybe in fact screening together with cavalry the deployment of legionary infantry to maybe fall back when the legions had to advance for combat. So it's pretty interesting. And it's interesting because Arrian's deployment of artillery is very similar to the one adopted by Vespasianus in Judea. This is Josephus Flavius, Jewish War 3:6, and the same Arrian recommends furthermore the deployment of artillery in battle, in part at least, on the advanced wings of the formation. So once again, what we found also in Caesar is that this artillery was deployed preferably on the wings and in advanced position. That is also pretty interesting, which also makes sense because especially the small artillery, as we have said, didn't make quite of a parabolic trajectory because it was meant to shoot at relatively close range. So in front of you, if you have cavalry, let's assume, you may even kill them with friendly fire. So if you place them instead in front of cavalry, they, by the way, can intervene pretty readily. So even if artillery is attacked, because they are mounted, they can move more speedily. You can't hit enemy cavalry that is incidentally a very good target, as we were saying before. So this is really important, and that explains actually a lot why the Romans invented this mounted artillery that was deployed so readily, so quickly at a tactical level, right? Not just for besieging one place, for the broader strategical dimension. No, this is something that really made a difference on the field, right? And the idea, though, behind this this position on the advanced wing was also to hit basically the enemy from the maximal distance possible, right? So Arrian's disposition is very interesting because it tells you that this stuff also had a pretty long range. And it could the objective was hitting the enemy by placing this artillery in an advanced position, and indeed you needed to you need to have the means to make it retreat in case of problem pretty quickly, right? And the rest of artillery instead, always according to Aryan, had to be deployed behind the first line in order to sustain, to support it before the commitment of all the infantry together with the archers and the javeliners. So basically, that usual role that archers and skirmishers in general was augmented by this use of artillery, right? So that in all battles there is this skirmishing phase that has the objective basically of screening each other's army and possibly overwhelming the enemy skirmishers in order to eventually soften up the enemy ranks unopposed before they attack, so that they're weakened. And the interesting part is that when there are skirmishers in the front, it's not that you can get rid of them pretty easily. I mean, you can make cavalry advance, but basically throw away that card in a way that is also pretty messy, because the skirmishers can easily run away and they don't operate very far from the infantry ranks. So that was usually not done. So basically, armies spent a freaking lot of time skirmishing, as we know, even hours and hours during the day of battle, because the actual melee between the heavy infantry is something that didn't last more than a few minutes. Right, it was repeated at intervals, but what do you do in the meanwhile? You simply skirmish. But during the skirmish, it's kind of difficult to do something else. As long as the skirmishers are in the middle, there can be confusion, etc. So the Romans, especially against those populations that didn't have this form of artillery, had a pretty heavy edge, because they could employ this mobile artillery that had a much longer range than the average archer and definitely javeliner, and therefore soften up the enemy ranks basically unopposed at that point, virtually unopposed. Naturally, things, this is not a formula that could be adopted literally in every single situation. Obviously, you have to have a decent ground. You have to be, artillery is not what resolved battles. Erase from your mind that the military technology at this time could have substantial asymmetries between the armies, right? But this is something that helped, definitely. They could make the tiny but still precious amount of losses among the enemy ranks that was enough to eventually to overwhelm him. And I would like to conclude actually with the psychological aspect that is brutally underestimated. For two orders of reason. The first one is it's the effect of artillery in general. All right, imagine this bolts arriving. Remember what Flavius Josephus said. That basically normal formations were things like 8 ranks deep. Just imagine a bullet passing through 8 people, and thinking what those people can really look like after that. So that's heavy from a psychological point of view, to see a person that is pierced from part to part by a bolt, or that is basically explodes when centered by one talent stone. Just imagine one talent stone, like 26 kilos, arriving at several 100 kilometer per hour or even more against a person. It's it transforms itself into a marmalade basically. So imagine the psychological effect of just one shot, which is in general in fact what artillery is about, right? As we were saying before, even in time of firearms, that's basically what in pitched battles artillery was like. So that's this freaking psychological effect. You have to think it's there is not much out there that scares you like that. I mean, obviously these people were used to disembowel each other, to decapitate each other in match wars, but that's something that you do because you physically go in front of that person, you hate his own guts, and you want to see them spilled on the ground, and you can't do it, and humans can't do it. But you're not used to see a person, beheaded with the head, flying off hundreds of meters away. That's kind of a terrifying thing, also because you think you can be next, right? So that's important. More than else, there is a broader ideological concept behind this. There is an episode now I can't quote, I don't remember, but one of the enemy, there was a Germanic chieftain that at one point is is hit by a Roman bolt of something, and it is found by the Romans eventually after the battle, literally impaled against a tree, because the bolt basically lifted him off and impaled him against a tree. Now, just think what that means from the side of a Germanic warrior perspective. Basically, the chieftain is the toughest person around, is the leader of warriors. There is all a mysticism about this. Also, the Romans share this. Also, the Romans are much closer, actually, in mindset in this warlike idea than we usually think. But what it means to basically to win with this means that obviously a German would consider like cowardly, because the idea is that a true man faces one man at a distance. And in fact, there are several of the same Roman historians saying this, that even when the Germans approach, for example, a fortified town, they said, we're made to fight against men and not against walls. Actually, this is the Romans catching the essence of the of German military culture and pride and ethos, etc., and really praising it, because the Romans were looking upon this primitive populations by saying, these guys are kind of barbarians, but they still have it, right? They still believe in the traditional customs, etc. And look at Rome now, so declining, and that's partly, by the way, the senatorial perspective that we bite as the kind of the decadentistic approach of the Roman Empire till the end, that it actually never existed. But the concept is that this is theoretically an unloyal measure. We have seen how the Romans, even at the beginning, shared this belief. But the concept here is that still the Romans win through these measures in part. At least the Romans want to show through their historiography that at which level Rome has arrived technologically speaking. So here now we are in the empire, of course, and we are in a phase in which Rome has by far gone beyond the traditional perplexities towards the adoption of technologies, and has partly adopted the same Hellenistic pride for technological achievements, etc. And as I was saying before, it wasn't really these technologies made battles won. I mean, they weren't really the decisive factor. They were a determining factor, not a decisive one. But they still were meant to show propagandistically to these other peoples that didn't have the engineeristic capabilities and not even the need to use to use artillery. I mean, the Germans didn't have cities, for example, to use this against, but they showed them that their gods were kind of more powerful than theirs, right? As we often say on Schwerpunkt, actually Rome and this other barbarian populations actually shared the same celestial deity. Of course, every people saw it in its own way, but the original concept was actually the same. The Romans naturally embellished it with all this classical mythology and interpretations derived from Greece, etc. But even from their own perspective, they were perfectly aware that Jupiter Capitolinus is the celestial deity of the sky that all Aryan peoples had before. So the Germans loathe the Romans because they think they are kind of the ones who win easily, right? By certain standards, or this is at least what the Romans want us to make us believe, because they wanted to praise their own technological accomplishments. But objectively, what was devastating for the Germanic warriors of that chieftains, comitatus, that saw their leader impaled to a tree because of a bolt that was shot from hundreds of meters away, from these Romans that fight in a way that they have never seen, or at least now they know, but they realize that that they have difficulties to cope with, would feel like. Because if the Romans won, it meant that it was still the deity of the sky that wanted it. They might have despised the mean, but they still say these guys have, I mean, the Romans have have it on their own. I mean, they probably estimated each other in this sense, which always happens between enemies, right? For not talking about, of course, the fact that the Romans always had, say, at this point during imperial times, German warriors from their side as well, that actually were surely probably more important than great part of their own, their artillery in this sense. But this idea of the technology that is able to show you that what is usually believed to be the safe boundary, like the city wall or the individual strength, is useless. It's something terrifying, especially for these most primitive populations, right? Because the Greeks had seen it all before, evidently, with this artillery and stuff. But what about the Germans? What about the Caledonians? What about peoples that didn't have that evidently had those cultural limits that by that time couldn't make them reach those same levels of the Romans, but that also were growing thanks to Rome in this broader perspective, the idea that there was a world that was more advanced. They wanted to imitate, I mean, if not to imitate, surely not in case of the Caledonians, not even for the Germans mostly, but they wanted to share, right? With, especially for the German side, the Germans didn't want to destroy the empire, simply wanted to enjoy its own benefits, not even by occupying it, but by carving a space for themselves into it. So these are things that, even technologically speaking, have to be to be conceived,